Hey internets, so this video is going to be a little bit different. I realized I have a lot of video ideas that never end up being completed because the topic I'm discussing in them are topics that don't really justify the sort of high-level editing and animation that I normally make in order to get their point across. And so I ended up just putting a lot of these ideas on hold. So instead I'm starting a new series where it's mostly just talking, some gaming and memes on the side, which allows me to actually make these videos instead of leaving them half-finished. Don't worry, I'll still be making my normal high-quality content too. This is just a special format for the topics that don't need a massively over-edited presentation to make the case. Anyways, the topic of the day, as the title suggests, is the Gish Gallop, and why it's a lot more prevalent than most people realize and a much bigger problem than most people realize. For anyone not aware of what a Gish Gallop is, it's a dishonest debate tactic where you focus on the quantity of arguments rather than the quality of arguments, with the goal of wasting your opponent's time. Basically, a debater utilizing the Gish Gallop tactic is taking advantage of the fact that live debates have very serious time constraints, and thus the galloper will make too many arguments for his opponent to possibly refute within said time constraints. At which point, they will then try to claim victory because all of their points were not addressed, and they have somehow won the debate. Or in simple terms, Gish Galloping is just spewing so much BS that it can't be refuted in its entirety. One of the reasons this is so effective is because people are often biased towards believing what they hear first. This is known as the anchoring bias. It's a known and well-documented cognitive bias that most people have, where if you hear something that sounds sincere, the majority of people will develop an irrational assumption that it's more likely to be true than any opposing claim just because they heard it first. For instance, if someone in a debate says that X is true, and then the debate opponent says no, X is not true, many people in the audience will view the dissenting opinion as less valid because his argument amounts to nothing more than saying, no, that is not valid, without giving any reason for why X is not true. But here's the thing, the first guy, when he claimed X is true, didn't provide any rational explanation for why X is true either. The two arguments side by side, X is true and X is not true, are actually equally valid. Or you could say equally invalid, since it's not really good reasoning to talk like that. But anyway, people are just biased towards expecting a better, more fleshed out response to what they heard first, even though there is absolutely no real logical reason for that to be the case. This bias is what the Gish Gallop primarily takes advantage of. It has its origins in the man named Juan Gish, who would regularly employ this tactic in creationist debates by basically making multiple rapid-fire false statements in his opening claim that made it virtually impossible to keep up with. Not just stating X is true, but also doubling down and saying that X, Y, Z, W, R, V, L, I, N is also true. And then the opponent is of course unreasonably expected to refute all of these false claims in the time span of a 30-minute to an hour or so long debate. Even if you are well educated on each of those subjects, refuting a massive pile of bull in a short amount of time eventually becomes unfeasible, and thus the audience often falls for this due to something known as the on-the-spot fallacy, where a claim is assumed to be true just because it couldn't be immediately refuted on the spot. Or they assume that because someone can't provide evidence or counter-arguments for or against a claim, then they assume the opposite is true. Of course, just because a point is not addressed does not magically make that the point is a good point, but a lot of people will naturally assume so, which is what the Gish Gallop technique, of course, is taking advantage of. Now, fortunately, most people who moderate debates these days, as well as just about everyone, is fully aware of Gish Galloping. Juan Gish came up with this tactic nearly 50 years ago, and so everyone, of course, can just spot it and call it out instantly whenever the tactic is employed, thus preventing the Gish Gallop from ever ruining our debates ever again. And debate bros live happily ever after. The end. Well, of course, fortunately, that is not the case. Gish Galloping is alive and well, and it's actually central to many debates you can find live streamed on the internet to this day. But wait, how can that be? Isn't everyone and their family, and their entire extended family, fully aware of Gish Galloping these days? How is it possible that people are still being fooled by this, and quite regularly, in fact, by such an obvious grift? And the answer is really simple. Time. It all comes back to time. While the Gish Gallop takes advantage of cognitive biases, the biggest problem that makes it so effective is that its goal is really just to waste your debate opponent's time. And in a live debate, time is like a limited currency, therefore people have an incentive to restrict their opponent's time usage as much as possible while maximizing their own. A general property people define the Gish Gallop by is that the many arguments it makes are false. But the thing is, does that really matter in a live debate? There are many debate bros, like Vouch for instance, that regularly make false statements on a consistent basis, and while they do get called out on their inaccurate claims post hoc, they often get away with it in the heat of the moment. And thus most people, since we all have lives to live outside of whatever media we are consuming, generally don't stick around beyond having the live Vouch debate play in the background while they are farming in World of Warcraft or whatever. So it all comes down, again, to the limited time constraints we all find ourselves in. We all have a limited time on this planet, and people just don't have enough to follow up on whether someone in a live debate was spewing facts or spewing nonsense. Because of this, the Gish Gallop is actually taking advantage of a central flaw in live debates, which is that it almost doesn't matter if what you are saying is true or not. Simply make good use of rhetoric and other forms of sophistry to come across as sincere, and you will win the audience through the framing effect, even with invalid points. Let me bring up a few examples of this to show exactly what the heck I'm talking about. So one of them being the use of the Socratic method. For those who don't know, the Socratic method is when you ask questions that are designed to get to the core of what someone believes, and then once you have gotten to there, you can then challenge that core belief by asking for evidence for it. There is nothing wrong inherently with the Socratic method, and it's actually very important to how the scientific method works and how rational thinking in general works. So I'm not bashing Socrates here or anything, it's a very valid system in order to get to the truth of things. The problem is, in order for the Socratic method to be valid, the questions must be asked in good faith, and a serious attempt must be made to understand the answers given to you, and you can't just ask dozens and dozens and dozens of questions. What I occasionally see, you can probably see where I'm going with this here, is in debates, people will try to use the Socratic method to sneak in a Gish Gallop. And most people don't even notice when this happens. For instance, one semi-well-known debater I know of is Sam Cedar. And he actually does occasionally do this. It's very easy to use the Socratic method in a bad faith manner to ask very dumb questions that require a very long time to explain. Emphasis, the time problem again. And then, if he really wants to double down on it, he might interrupt his opponent while they are trying to answer his barrage of questions with another question in the middle of more questions. Sam doesn't do this all the time in all of his debates, but I've noticed it enough in the 5 hours or so of his content that I've watched that it's definitely noticeable when you're aware of it. Instead of saying multiple false statements that no one has the time to refute in a live debate setting, the Socratic form of the Gish Gallop asks multiple questions, generally not in good faith, and then when someone doesn't have an answer on the spot, aha, you don't have an immediate answer to my barrage of questions. I win the debate. Ding ding. And another example of a hidden Gish Gallop is the good old-fashioned appeal to authority. As someone pulls out the "it's the academic scientific consensus" card without any specific data or argument that's actually being made, they're basically implying that their opponent has to now somehow, on the spot and with their limited time frame of this debate, refute an entire school of thought. This of course cannot be done in the limited time of a live debate. So it's functionally the same thing as a Gish Gallop. This is why in my academic consensus video, my big main point on it was that people should be citing specific data and specific studies, and should actually have an understanding of those studies that is at least comprehensive enough that they can defend the rationale behind it. I am always immediately turned off when I am watching a debate and some twat goes, it's the consensus, and they don't actually know why it's the consensus, and can't defend it further than that because they don't actually know anything. They're just doing it to make an argument that they know their opponent doesn't have the time to refute. This has become a serious problem because in recent years a lot of people suffering from a terminal midwititis seem to unironically make the argument that more scientific consensus or appeals to authority like this are actually valid arguments. They are not. They're lazy arguments. They don't actually display any real knowledge of the subject. It's really pathetic. And specifically in a live debate, it's also an unfalsifiable argument since you don't have the time to refute it ad hoc, and thus you can only deal with this kind of thing post hoc. I'm especially tired of seeing leftist debate bros pull this one on debates of woke nonsense. Oh, sociologists overwhelmingly agree with me. Wow, really? A field of academic study where around 1/4 of the professors openly identify as Marxist agree with wokeoid crap? Wow, thank you so much for providing with this enlightening knowledge. This is totally not something that we didn't all already know. This is especially in poor taste when it comes from a person whose beliefs closely align with those of the political elite. These people are what I like to call Google debaters. Basically, they Google it and then push whatever claptrap you can read on Wikipedia as if it's fact. The big grift they will often do is lead the discussion somewhere for their debate opponent where they are expected to refute this massive pile of establishment propaganda on the spot. Trust the experts. A pretty standard example of this is definitely, unfortunately, Destiny, because I don't really dislike Destiny, but I find his position to be kind of silly at times. He's what I would consider a standard neoliberal type leftist, and of course, since neoliberals are the ones generally in charge of the world systems right now, it's very easy for him to defend any position that he has, even if he isn't very well informed on that subject, by simply defecting to the neolib consensus, or basically just repeating whatever is found in the top few responses on Google. The problem with this is, like I said, Destiny himself, along with most of the other people out there who debate from neolib establishment standpoints, usually only have a general layman's understanding of most of the subjects they are debating on. So if they go up against someone who knows what they are actually talking about, the debate can easily devolve into a shit show, because again, when a Google debater runs into something that they can't actually solve with Google, things just go sideways and they just try to double down on academic consensus. This all bleeds into the issue with poor quality journalism in general. If the mainstream media decides to collude on a bogus narrative, they can quickly create something very similar to a Gish Gallop. I mentioned this about a half a year ago or so when talking about Gamergate and Wikipedia. Gamergate is far more complex than most people realize, but the main grift surrounding it is that Gamergate, especially as it exists today, is more of a movement about criticism of modern journalism that later has evolved to be more about criticism of wokeness in the media in general. However, if you try to read articles about it, you will find hundreds of hit pieces by big name publishers such as The Atlantic or Vox or Kotaku or whatever, all demonizing Gamergate as some kind of misogynistic harassment campaign. All of these articles heavily make use of sophistry and lies of omission, as any savvy readers who knows how to tell the difference between opinion and factual reporting will notice. All of these pieces surrounding Gamergate are entirely based on subjective opinion and make heavy use of fallacious reasoning to make their case. But because there are so many of these hit pieces, all filled with various blends of half-truths and nonsense all blended together, it's very difficult to refute all of it. You can summarize a general refutation of all this nonsense as journalists investigated themselves and found no wrongdoing. By the way, the people accusing journalists of wrongdoing are secretly all misogynies, which again is why anyone capable of thinking for themselves know that there's definitely something not quite right with the general establishment consensus on Gamergate. And while it's possible to refute this massive amount of claptrap with time, if we take it back to the confines of a timed debate, then it becomes a huge problem. All a woke sheep has to do, when engaged in a live debate centered around topics that the media was overwhelmingly dishonest about, is cite garbage article after garbage article after garbage article after garbage article. It's basically a Gish Gallop by proxy. This allows a complete and total ignoramus to debate or discuss a topic at length simply by reading whatever is written on Wikipedia and then just going over the sources. It's very dumb and also very sad because, again, tons of people fall for it and don't realize that these people don't actually have any idea what they're talking about. But honestly, appeals to authority are nothing compared to this last form of Gish Gallop that I'll be mentioning, which is using rhetoric and constantly arguing semantics in order to gaslight your opponent and completely waste their time. You see, it's not just demonstrably incorrect statements that can take form for a Gish Gallop. A constant barrage of sophistry to deal with where a debater is intentionally deceptive and argues in bad faith all the time are still points that must be refuted because sophistry is extremely effective at convincing the audience, which means that when dealing with someone who uses sophistry, you are forced to address the asinine way that their arguments have been framed in addition to whatever other points that they have made, thus wasting your time. And yes, Vaush, once again, is a massive example of this. For instance, I've seen Vaush use rhetorical questions along the lines of, "Do I not have the right to make the world a better place?" when asked how he justifies using the state to force people to behave in certain ways. On its face, that kind of rhetoric is completely circular, because Vaush is basically assuming that his justification of using state force would result in a good consequence, and that it's therefore justified. Problem is, nobody notices that he didn't actually provide any evidence that this so-called good consequence would actually occur. But the disgusting thing is, he doesn't have to, because with people like Vaush, the majority of people watching him are people who already agree with him, which means that the people in chat will just assume that he is in the right, and no one notices the massive grift of assuming he is correct to prove that he is correct that just got pulled. Or another example I saw was when he was debating a philosophy PhD and tried to say that H2O wasn't water, because it's different in Spanish. Let me say that again. He tried to say that H2O was not water, because it's a different word in Spanish. Yeah. Anyway, which at first may just seem like Vaush is being dumb, because obviously H2O is water. That's basic elementary school science. But there's a bit more to it than that. The context was that he was just trying to deny something, anything, to trip his opponent up and catch him off guard. The point, once again, all comes down to wasting his opponent's time with nonsense, and most people don't notice this when looking to spot a Gish Gallop. People are always thinking that a Gish Gallop has to be in the format of inaccurate claim Z on top of inaccurate claim Y, on top of claim W, claim R, claim T, etc, etc, etc. But it can also come from rhetoric on top of sophistry on top of more rhetoric on top of more sophistry. And so many people don't realize that when Vaush does this, he's Gish Galloping. He's totally Gish Galloping. I watched tons of Vaush's debates when I did my refuting BreadTube video about his content, and people just let him get away with it and don't notice that he's just Gish Galloping the entire time. Anyway, where I'm going here is that Gish Galloping is unfortunately an integral part of the live debate. Because time is so precious in the live format, being able to get more jabs in than your opponent will always be an advantage. And thus, argumentation forms that are designed to waste your opponent's time while maximizing your use of time will always be a top tier strategy. Like it or not, the Gish Gallop is here to stay. Now, I'm not trying to say that debates are bad and that you shouldn't ever enjoy watching them or experiencing them or whatever you want, but I am saying that the tactics that some of the most popular debaters use are not really tactics of honesty, but tactics for getting away with blasting their opponent with too much nonsense for them to possibly refute. And the person who is more rhetorically skilled at doing so in a way that the majority of normies won't notice that they're doing it is generally the person who wins the audience, which effectively wins the debate regardless of whether or not it's an official win, if that even matters. This is why I'm generally not in a rush to play with debate bros. The live debate structure just isn't a very useful format for determining truth, and so it tends to deceptively give credence to a lot of very bad arguments that would never fly in a less time-sensitive structure without being eventually called out. Debates can definitely be entertaining though, and they can occasionally expose outright liars, as well as people who don't actually make their own points and just have others do the research for them. But most of the time, live debates seem to sway the audience in directions that aren't really based in sound reason. I've seen debates where very well-known and very popular debate bros were clearly and outright lying and just completely running off their mouth with rhetoric and disinformation like a machine gun, and everyone just lets them completely get away with it. So in conclusion, have fun with debates if you want, just be aware that the format is susceptible to letting bad ideas slip through the cracks. If you like the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that. Oh, and let me know in the comments whether you like this style of content or not, because it should let me put out an extra video or two a month. And again, I'm still going to be making my normal content too. This is just something that's slightly easier and lets me make some of my videos that would have otherwise ended up getting scrapped. Anyways, that's all for now. Till next time.